Have you ever played Monopoly? When the person you're playing against has got Regent Street, Oxford Street, Bond Street, Park Lane and Mayfair and stuck hotels on all of them. My jammy little brother does that to me. You don't stand a chance, do you? In some ways, today's Bible passage reminds me of that, where someone's hogging the board and you get stung for it. Well, the game Monopoly hadn't been invented in Jesus' time, and so he uses a different picture, as we'll see a bit later on. Today we come to week 3 of our Lent study series, following Jesus through the last week of his life. And it's Tuesday, a day where Jesus faced lots of angst as he was repeatedly challenged by the Jewish religious leaders who were trying to trip him up. If the day before was Meltdown Monday, then today could be called Troublesome Tuesday, judging by the number of times they tried to question his authority. The part of the story I'm going to focus on today is the parable of the tenants from Mark chapter 12, starting at verse 1. So if you haven't read it yet, then pause the video and go and read it. Mark chapter 12, beginning at verse 1. Now I think there are probably a number of ways of looking at this story. It's a parable after all. Each of the characters represent a part of the teaching that Jesus wants to give. One way it could be looked at is if the landowner in the story is God himself. The tenants are the Jewish people, the servants are the various prophets over the years whom God sends but whom are rejected. And finally, the Son himself, Jesus, whom they were supposed to respect, but whom they killed. And we can see that played out later in the week as we get closer to the events of Good Friday. But for now, on the Tuesday, Jesus is trying to warn them about what it is that he actually sees and the consequences of that. You see, the Jewish leaders themselves, the ones who are challenging Jesus, feature in his story. And suddenly it dawns on them midway through that Jesus is pointing the finger at them. Now this makes them even more narky. There's a certain irony to all this. You see, when Jesus started speaking in the temple that day, the chief priests and the temple leaders could be forgiven for thinking that they were in fact in the role of landowner, not tenant. They were acting as if they had the right to lord it over their tenants and pronounce judgment on them, treating them unjustly. And it's for exactly that reason that Jesus takes them to task. God, the real landowner, had entrusted the land to the Jewish people. But they, particularly the leaders whom he now addressed, they had failed miserably. They should have been living out God's story, encouraging fruit, encouraging worship and the right values, but instead they were fruitless. We saw that last week. The vineyard in the story, of course, was a metaphor for Israel itself, the land that God had given to their ancestors. And when he'd originally given it to them, the land was full of potential and ready to flourish. But something had happened. In Jesus' story here, he says that the landowner, and remember, for the moment at least, Jesus was insinuating that the Jewish leaders were acting as if they themselves were in that role. The landowner planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a wine press and built a watchtower. Just like that game of Monopoly. Why mention all that if it wasn't relevant. You see, instead of sharing the gift that God had given them like they were supposed to, the Jewish leaders had effectively put up a fence and created an exclusion zone, an enclave just for them. Any fruit was theirs. Any relationship with God was their privilege and theirs alone. They had been protecting their own interests. The watchtower, you could say, added to that sense. The Jewish leaders had eyes and ears everywhere. They ruled the roost and would do anything just to keep things the way they were. The vineyard had become an exclusive place, their place. And as for the fruit, the godly values that we could expect, well, there wasn't any, because they were too busy protecting their own interests. It must have been pretty hard hitting for those Jewish leaders, but before we judge them, let's consider whether we can learn anything from the story too. Jesus says in verse 9, "What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and give the vineyard to others." Supposing now we put ourselves in the story, not as landowners, but as tenants, with the land being God's gift of salvation, his gift of relationship with him forever, that we're to share with others. We're to tend the land, encourage fruit, reveal something of his love to those around us. His entrusted people, relationships, circumstances, and events in our lives. Our church, the decisions and choices we make daily, our hopes, concerns, they're all areas where God is waiting for us to work with him to produce kingdom fruit, all part of the vineyard. But what if we're to keep that privilege for ourselves? What if we fail to welcome strangers into our lives, those who are different to us? What if we put up fences? When Jesus came, we saw a man who dined with the wrong sort of people, who chose to put love and compassion first above all else. A man who was totally inclusive, a man who brought hope and healing, hospitality and welcome, generosity to the poor, reconciliation, justice, and ultimately total self-surrender to the rule of love. And that's the type of kingdom fruit, the values and actions that Jesus was looking for from those Jewish leaders. And you know what? He's looking for it from us too. When those Jewish leaders put up their fences, not only did they keep others out, but they effectively shut out God himself, the real landowner. And because they did, ultimately, they would be the ones who would miss out on relationship with him. And it's possible for us to do the same if we're not careful. When we fail to live the Jesus story, to follow his example, to live like him, when we reject him and walk in the opposite direction, when we put up barriers to keep God's love out or close our ears because we don't like what he's saying to us, we're the ones who miss out. When we hold on to grudges, when we resent others, when we judge others, or when we're critical or negative in our spirits. When we go through life on autopilot, failing to be present to God, we exclude ourselves from the kingdom. But here's the thing. There's good news in the story. There is. That's why Jesus told it. He wanted them to know it, and that it was still possible to turn things around. Do you notice the way in which God keeps on coming back? He is persistent. He batters our hearts with his love and forgiveness. He longs for us to embrace his kingdom. For God so loved the world that he sent his Son. He did that for me, and he did that for you. He came for us all, the weak and the strong, rich and poor, the open-hearted and those who were emotionally challenged. Jesus even kept plugging away at those Jewish leaders. He didn't want to give up on them either, and he doesn't want to give up on us. Hear this. This is the God who actively pursues us, who lavishes his grace upon us, the generous, forgiving, life-giving God. Oh, friends, whatever conflict you have going on in your life, whatever seems to trip you up or leave you feeling battered and bruised or weary and unsure, whatever choices you've made that have left you feeling on the wrong side of his kingdom, a bit distant from his love and his help, know this, and this is where I want to finish this morning, this evening even. Even now, he calls us to the throne of his grace. He calls us to the throne of his grace. Don't say no to that.